Now we get to move to our second article, which will be presented by Professors Kelly Hewett and Michel Ballings from the University of Tennessee. Kelly and Michel are going to present research that examines how marketers of experiential events, such as concerts, sports competitions, and other sponsored events, can use social media to drive customer engagement and influence customers' perceptions of their experience at that event. We thank you in advance for sharing your insights on this important topic, Kelly and Michel. And just as a reminder to the audience, again, if you want to ask a question, please feel free to and use the left part of your screen, the Q&A tab. And with that, I will turn it over to Kelly and Michel.
Thank you, Paige. I'm going to advance us. And first of all, Michel and I wanted to acknowledge that we do have co-authors who are not able to join us today, Matas Mir, D. Kumar, and Dirk van den Pol. So we'd like to also acknowledge them and thank them for their input to the project. And would also like to thank all of you for your interest in our research. We're really excited to share our results with you today. So we're going to start by identifying what we saw as the key issue for marketers addressed in this study. We noted that marketers are increasingly using social media content in an attempt to influence customers' engagement in social media, or the comments that they post related to brands or firms. And in the case of experiential events, as Paige mentioned, such as concerts or competitions among teams, or other brand interactions that take place at a fixed point in time, we saw that marketers often use social media either during or after those events to try and influence customers' engagement. And at times they use content, I advanced it too quickly. At times they use content that is more emotional in nature, attempting to arouse emotion or inspire customers to post positive comments. But they also, we saw, post informational content that is not necessarily aimed at driving emotional responses or engagement. So looking at research related to this issue, we noted that a missing piece of the story that seems important is that studies typically explore customers' engagement in social media but don't consider what's happening offline in terms of their brand or firm interactions, which we felt was a really important missing piece. So a key question we felt warranted exploration is if and how marketers should adjust their social media content based on their performance during customers' interactions, or whether that performance is likely to lead to positive or negative customer experiences. So should they post informational content or emotional content based on a poor or a positive experience, and which of those is going to be most beneficial in terms of influencing sentiment? Which approach is going to lead to greater positive sentiment? So we're first going to describe the key concepts in our study and then give some examples of each of these types of content to illustrate the questions that we aim to answer. So we see here the key concepts that we examine are, first, customers' digital engagement or their brand-related contributions in social media and the sentiment of those contributions in particular. We also examine firms' initiatives in social media surrounding those customer interactions. So to illustrate these concepts, we provide some examples here for you. On the right-hand side, we see in Facebook a post by the Arizona Cardinals, and in the upper part of that image, we see a post with an emotionally toned message, the comment, "Let's go," with a rather emotional photo of players coming together to motivate each other at a game. And then we see the comments from the fans below that post that are fairly positive in tone in terms of their sentiment. One saying, "That's what I'm looking for," and the other saying, "My hopes for this team are growing." And then on the left-hand side, or in the center of the slide, we see a different example, this one from Twitter, and we see a tweet from Mercedes-Benz Stadium in Atlanta during the first ever concert held at that venue. It was a Garth Brooks concert, and the tweet in the upper portion of the image that you see there has content that is informational in nature as opposed to emotional. It says audio engineers are working through the sound issues with the artists. So as we see here, things were not going well with the performance at the concert in terms of sound issues. And then we also see on the lower part of that image the negatively toned fan tweet example during that experience, saying they can't hear anything. The comment is, "Come on, Mercedes-Benz Stadium." And again, we note that the venue was posting informational content during that experience. So our question then has led us to wonder whether when you have a poor performance or a disappointing customer experience during an offline interaction, as in the Garth Brooks example, whether informational content, as the stadium posted, or emotional content would have a greater effect on customer sentiment or lead to more positive customer sentiment. And in the case of a strong performance or a positive customer experience, which would be more effective in lifting sentiment? This is the crux of the question that our study answers. And we also examine in our study why sentiment matters, why marketers should focus on lifting sentiment of customers in social media. Now I'm going to turn things over to Michel, who's going to explain our approach to answering these questions.
Thank you, Kelly. For study one, we developed a custom Facebook application which customers could opt into to let us collect 265,000 comments, user interests, and page likes. We matched these data with season ticket purchase transaction data obtained from a European soccer team. Finally, we also collected the team's Facebook posts, comments on these posts, direct email, the performance of the team measured by game outcomes, so that would be lose, draw, or win, expectations measured by betting odds, and stakes, or the importance of games, measured by attendance. An example of emotional content that we observed in our data is all together now, and an example of informational content is our next game is against XYZ. Our main findings are as follows. Emotional content positively impacts sentiment regardless of the game outcome. Informational content impacts sentiment, but only after a loss. This effect is quite strong, and with more informational posts, positive sentiment for losses can be brought up to the level of wins. To be specific, we found that if we increase the number of informational posts after a loss by 4 posts, customer sentiment rises by 20%. And we point out a couple of examples in this slide. We also found that customer sentiment is a leading indicator in customer lifetime value. Specifically, we found a positive association with customer purchases, which in our case are season tickets purchased on an annual basis. Why does this matter? Well, consider any product category with a long purchase cycle, such as a car or another vehicle. Measuring sentiment on social media provides a proxy or a leading indicator of CLV and affords the company to take action in a proactive fashion. So for study 2, we did a scenario experiment to confirm the findings of study 1. Respondents read one of 4 scenarios, which they were told to be on their team's Facebook page. And so when presented with these scenarios, they were told to imagine their favorite sports team. The first one was the team was expected to win, but they lost. The team was expected to win, and they won. The team was expected to lose, and they lost. And the fourth one was the team was expected to lose, and they won. They then read either emotional content or informational content. Specifically, the emotional stimulus content was Everyone come to the stadium for the next game to encourage the team. Thanks, fans, for the fantastic support. We are one team. And the informational content stimulus was, our next game is against XYZ. Did you know where there were X spectators in the stadium today? And player X played his 200th game today. Then we measured their sentiment using an effective scale, allowing us to compare the sentiment per scenario. We found that emotional content positively influences sentiment in all cases. Informational content positively impacts sentiment in case of a loss. That means these findings are consistent with study 1. I now turn it back over to Kelly.
Thanks, Michel. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we see as key implications for marketers from our findings. Well, first of all, our advice to marketers would be to develop strategies that call for customizing their social media content based on the performance during customers' offline experiences or interactions with the brand. And I apologize, the slides have a little bit of a mind of their own today. So I'm sticking with this slide. If there's evidence on the marketer's part of a strong performance during an offline interaction, or as on the left here, we would suggest that marketers should increase the volume of posts with emotional content. And while we don't find any negative impact of informational content with positive experiences, we do see that emotional content has an overall positive influence regardless of the level of performance, as Michel mentioned. So it never seems to be a bad idea to post emotional content. However, it's in the case of a negative experience during a customer interaction that our results indicate that marketers should increase the volume of posts with informational content. That is where the improvement in sentiment will happen. So the impact on sentiment are going to come after a poor performance with informational content. We actually noticed in practice that many firms track buyers' offline interactions, not only their presence at events, but their performance indicators such as wait times and lines, even issues such as sound quality at concerts, as in the Garth Brooks example, or take sports competitions. There's often real-time objective data on factors like lead changes or availability of merchandise or concessions that might influence customers' overall experiences during those events. And it's by bringing those insights to bear on firms' social media strategies that we would argue can enable firms to influence the sentiment of customers' engagement, which we then also show can lift customer purchases. So aside from customizing their content, we see a few other important takeaways, we believe, for marketers. First, we believe our results demonstrate the value of investing in processes for tracking customer sentiment in social media. We noted that a lot of firms question whether their investments were paying off, and we believe our results reinforce the need for these tracking systems, and if possible, attempting to link them to performance. And with an estimated 40% or more of consumers following their favorite brands on social media, this seems to be a pretty sizable opportunity for firms. Another benefit of these tracking efforts is that the sentiment of customers' comments in social media is in many cases available on a much more frequent basis than other sources of customer feedback. For example, customer surveys. And because of that frequency, they might be more effectively used at enabling firm interventions. Aside from the benefits of tracking, we show that marketers can positively influence customers' purchase behaviors by improving their sentiment. So if we take that together with this greater regular access to customer sentiment information, we believe that this suggests marketers may be able to identify high-value customers without having to wait for the transaction data to be available to them in order to estimate their value. So in cases like ours, with purchases happening only once per year, or for other purchase cycles that are relatively long, such as non-consumables or durables, this could be a pretty powerful implication of our findings. So with that, we'll close and open the floor for any questions.
Thank you so much, Kelly and Michelle. That's really, really interesting and timely work. To the audience, again, please feel free to type in your questions in that Q&A box on the left, and I will direct them to these authors. Let's see. Here's one. Let's see. The findings suggest specific actions for poor performance, but do you have any specific recommendations for how the marketer should respond to a strong one?
Sure. Our results suggest that in a case of a strong performance, the emotional content is not necessarily going to result in a lift in customer sentiment. That result held only for the case of a poor performance. So in a case of a positive performance or a strong performance, what we would advise would be the use of emotional content, which we found has a positive influence on customer sentiment regardless the marketer's performance during a customer interaction. In other words, it never hurts. Emotional content is good across the board regardless of performance, and so that's what we would advise.
Really interesting. Do you have any thoughts about why the information content following a negative experience is so effective at increasing the consumer sentiment?
Sure. That actually speaks to or looks. If we look at the theoretical arguments that we put forth in the paper, I'll go back to those. The logic there is there's evidence that when consumers or people in general are in a negative state of mind, so they've had a negative experience, that they tend to be in more of an information-seeking mode. So if we think of it in terms of, you could even take the sports example that we have here. European Soccer League, you have these crazy fans. A negative experience leaves people questioning why the negative outcome. And so they're looking for information to try to rationalize that experience. Why did the team lose? Was it because somebody was hurt, for example? As opposed to, in a positive state of mind, they are more receptive to this imagery-laden or affective-laden type of content. And so we think that the informational content is effective based on this negative affective state that consumers would be in after a poor performance when they're trying to make sense of it, so to speak.
Right. That makes sense post hoc, but I'm not sure we would have guessed that prior to your work. I have another question for you. Can you share some of your findings related to consumers' expectations or customers' expectations leading into an event? I know that was a significant part, particularly in Study 2, and very cleverly collected in Study 1 with the betting odds. So could you talk a little bit more about the role of expectations?
Yeah, so obviously expectations are important, so what we found is that if the result is unexpected, that is only good when there is an actual win, which makes total sense. In all other cases, unexpected results are bad. This is sort of consistent with what one would expect before collecting the data, and this gives us confidence that the relationships that we find in our model are correct.
But let's add that even in that situation, when you have, let's say, expectations of a positive outcome or a win, and then there's a negative outcome or a loss, we still show, even in that case, that with informational content, by posting more informational content, that we can actually turn the sentiment around to be either level with, and in some cases even higher than the sentiment was with a positive outcome.
And that's a pretty powerful tool, especially if, in other contexts when those expectations are so emotionally laden, like in a sports event, that you can actually turn that around even with a negative surprise.
true.
Let's see. I had a question about the Study One data set. Could you talk a little bit about how you managed to source all of the information that you did and compile it, and what went into developing the Facebook page?
Absolutely. There are three sources of data. Let's say the first source is the customer transaction data, and for that we had to work with the company, so the European Soccer Club, and that data contained season ticket purchases and other custom-related information. The second source of data was data pertaining, Facebook data pertaining to fans, and for that, that's not something that you can just grab from Facebook. You have to develop a Facebook application, which then has to be authorized by Facebook, and which allows to collect certain pieces of information. And of course, fans or people using Facebook have to authorize that application also. And that was probably the largest chunk of work. There's a lot of things that need to happen in developing that code, writing that code. And then the last piece is information that is publicly available on the Facebook page. So everything that you would see on the Facebook page that could be collected. And so then we proceeded to a matching process where we looked at common variables in these data sources and matched these data sources to arrive at the final analysis table.
Both creative and effortful, so it's quite impressive what you put together with that. I have a couple more questions on context that I think are interesting both to academics and to practitioners. Can you talk a little bit about how your findings relate to the stakes or importance of the event, or how important a particular interaction is? Does that matter?
Certainly. So it's reasonable to assume that if an event is more important than another, that should play a role. And to measure the stakes, we used event attendance. So the more people that attend a game, the more important the game. And so what we found is that high-stake matches, so matches with a large attendance, that result in a draw can deliver more negative sentiment than high-stake matches that result in a loss. So there's definitely something interesting going on there in that a draw is really unsatisfying.
Right. Yeah, it's kind of curious, we thought, too. But again, even in that situation, the data would suggest that marketers can combat that based on their posts as well.
Yeah, absolutely. One thought that we also had is that this might be related to the entertainment value of a game. In that sometimes people mention that, well, they lost, but they fought hard, and sometimes a draw is really comes across as unsatisfying. All this effort for nothing. So that is sort of the summary of our thoughts on that question.
That's really interesting because it's two different types of negative affect that may be needed to be managed differently, and certainly leaves a lot of opportunities for future research on those emotional topics. Got one more question here, and again, to the audience, we still have a little time, so if you'd like to send in another question, we'll have an opportunity to ask it. But this one, is this model applicable outside of performances with groups in attendance such as games or concerts? Do you know what boundary conditions might be on these findings?
Good question. We obviously weren't able to test this model on a separate data set. You know, luckily, we weren't asked to do that. What we believe we're seeing is that a likely extension would be to other forms of customer interactions where the marketer can track performance. So, for example, if a customer experiences a significantly delayed flight or some other service where there's a clear set of evidence of a customer having a negative reaction or negative state, affective state as opposed to a positive one, then we would argue that our results would suggest that customizing one-on-one communications with those customers makes sense, and if the theoretical arguments that we use hold, that customers in a negative affective state are going to be in an information-seeking mode, and that type of content would be more receptive, they'd be more receptive to that type of content, then it should extend to those circumstances as well. We think that the customer's affective state is the key issue in terms of the effect of this informational content, and so marketers should be able to leverage what we've learned in these other contexts.
Yeah, that's a really good example of how far this might extend. I have one more question for you all. It just came in. Let's see. Nonprofit organizations typically have an annual fundraising event to secure donations. What would your research suggest, i.e., balance of emotional and informational content before and to achieve donation goals from those attending? To clarify, what's the balance of emotional or informational content on social media before such a nonprofit fundraising event?
Good question. I'm trying to think, did we at some stage look at the emotion leading into the event? I don't believe we were able to look at that because we were specifically looking at the tactics of the marketer after the interaction with the customer. So I don't think we have specific evidence.
Yes, I think if this nonprofit organization would have had a negative event versus a positive, then our study sort of could recommend whether you would want to do emotional or informational. But our study is really about the interaction between firm performance or event outcomes and marketer actions. So without more context, sort of saying, was there a negative event or a positive event, our study would not allow us to answer this question.
However, I would say our finding regarding just emotional content in general, lifting sentiment, might suggest that would be the going into this scenario expectation that I would say marketers should leverage.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and that the nonprofit, particularly with the charity appeals, brings up a lot of different types of emotions. Sort of, it's not the hedonic, I'm trying to have a good time for myself, but I'm actually trying to do this to help someone else, and whether or not you can achieve those goals. Those raise some really interesting questions that going forward.